I will skim through the slides because we just mentioned around the recording part. We will definitely go ahead and talk about the questions in the end, but let's take a quick look at today's session objectives. During this session, I'm going to cover common configurations, tools, and we're going to talk about the overall infrastructure that is required to set up hybrid. Where we start is why hybrid, and with this demo, which I'm going to show, we are essentially trying to go ahead and look at an environment which has users who has just subscribed to an Office 365 tenant. And at the end of this session, they should be able to, get search results both from their on-premises SharePoint environment as well as from online environment. So, first of all, why hybrid? And this question came up, in most of the sessions that we discussed around any of the hybrid workloads. Hybrid is, is typically a solution in which you have an on-premises environment, okay? And as I mentioned, you either have a Office 365 tenancy, which you would want to kind of leverage as your other vertical other than the on-prem, and also consume workloads across both the environments. There can be multiple reasons where one would mention that, I simply cannot shut down my entire on-premises. There can be custom applications. There can be definitive requirements about the environments which people have been consistently using. And what we get out of hybrid is a combined work stream which the user, which exists as of today, gets to consume across both SharePoint Online and the SharePoint on-premises. I mentioned SharePoint because we're talking about SharePoint hybrid out here. So even before we move further into this, let's look at what are some of the SharePoint hybrid scenarios which comes into the supported, so-called supported bracket. We have business connectivity services, through which we'll be able to read, write, and access to external data from the LOB business systems. Like, you have a data source outside of SharePoint, you want to consume that data and display it as a web part or a list within SharePoint. BCS workload supports hybrid. Of course, search, which is the scope of today's session. We should be able to configure so in today's session, we are doing an outbound search, but hybrid supports two-way search, which means irrespective of whichever environment you go to, be it on-prem or online, you would be able to search across the opposite vertical. Of course, do it for enterprise, which extends the reach of, the SharePoint and gets the SAP data into Microsoft Cloud. And as I mentioned, our focus for today, definitely with the time frame which we have, is to look at just search as a workload. Okay, so when we say search as a workload, let's first look into the overall picture about an environment and why would they want to go with hybrid search before we further proceed with this kind of session. So assume I'm an user, and I have a domain in my on-premises, which is so-called my on-premises domain, which I have SharePoint 2013. And I subscribe, and my company just decided to subscribe to, or rather got a Office 365 subscription. Even if we, from Microsoft, even if we go ahead and reach out to any of this so-called user, which I say it as me, and I say, okay, now that you have got Office 365, why don't you simply shut down your, your on-premises environment and go to the Office 365 cloud? Well, it's not possible, right? So, because of a very simple reason, maybe I have like 50,000 or 70,000 site collections. Can I migrate all of them in the same day? No, right? So now let's look back at the user base who resides in my on-prem. I need to reach out to them and say, guys, we have Office 365. Now we are planning to go ahead and migrate to Office 365 over a period of XYZ months. However, every day in the morning, I'm going to send you an email saying 15 site collections has been migrated to online, and rest of the 75,985 site collections are on-prem. So you need to decide where you need to search, and based on that, you need to log into URL 1 or URL 2 and search for your documents. I bet nobody is going to like it, right? So that's where hybrid comes into play. Okay, or that's where we start. At the end of a hybrid solution, what we would typically do is, from an end user base, the URL they have been using still remains the same. What we configure in the background is a workload which is the search in Office 365 SharePoint, SharePoint, and we establish a communication mechanism through which we will be able to remotely query the opposite vertical and render search results to the same user, which means user will still go to their HTTP search URL, but when they search for a keyword, they don't need to worry whether their site collection resides in those 15 site collections which has been migrated, or they reside in those 79,000 site collections which haven't been migrated, because the results are returned from both of these environments based on the rights that this XYZ user has in these two, verticals. So when we say implementation of hybrid search, we talk about topologies. There are three types of topologies, or hybrid search can be classified into three broad categories or three broad topologies, so-called, okay? One is one-way outbound topology. As you see on your screen right now, you have your on-premises SharePoint 2013 Enterprise Search Portal. And what you do is you configure an outbound hybrid with Office 365 SharePoint Online, which means when the user logs into his on-premises environment, he or she will be able to query and get to see results from SharePoint 2013 on-prem, as well as results will be returned from SharePoint Online. However, if the user logs into SharePoint Online, he will only get results from SharePoint Online. That's the one-way outbound topology. The next one is one-way inbound topology, which is exactly the opposite of which I just mentioned, which means from SharePoint Online, we configure a hybrid search with SharePoint on-prem. Users logging into SharePoint on-prem gets to see search results only from within the SharePoint on-premises environment. However, from online environment, they get to see search results from online, as well as results are returned from on-premises as well. Okay. With that comes the third one, and which is what I was saying, that we can say that it is three types of topologies, or we can say two distinct topologies. But if you choose to implement both of these topologies, it becomes bidirectional topology, which is what ideally everyone would like to go for, which means user doesn't need to worry where they are logging in from. They can log in from SharePoint Online, or they can log in from SharePoint on-premises, and they would be able to get to see results from both the environments, which is SharePoint on-prem and SharePoint Online. So a true two-way would get them, exactly as what we see in the screen. Our recommendations, based on what we have been seeing as a trend, is the easier one is to go one-way outbound, Now, when we say why easier, because when you set up one-way outbound hybrid, which is what I'm going to show the end user experience right now, right? So when you set up one-way outbound hybrid, the results are returned from on-prem as well as online in separate verticals. However, the infrastructure is a requirement which you anyway have to set. Essentially, what I'm trying to explain in this example is when you set up outbound hybrid, you anyway have to set up the infrastructure, which we are going to talk about shortly. And after that, you can just go ahead and create the result sources and query rules, which will start returning results in the outbound. However, inbound has some specific requirements, which we can, which we will focus on, but that's not today's scope. And, that's considered to be a more specific requirement, like you need certificates from a public certification authority and stuff like that. You need a reverse proxy, for the inbound queries to come in. So what we see in the screen right now is exactly what we should be seeing at the end of this session today. We are going to actually go ahead and do that practically as well, or rather, I'm going to show you a practical hands-on on that. Before even we get into the details, okay, let's look at how's the query flow. Okay, when we are trying to go ahead and when the user is trying to go ahead and type in a keyword, or when the user has typed in a keyword and he presses enter to go ahead and retrieve the search result, the first thing which happens is the query processing component calls to the index components, okay, to retrieve the query results. However, what is being used, remember, is it has to be an authenticated user, which means we use the context of the user, and that is typically to go out and ensure we have the correct ACL. Okay. And once that is done, then the query processing component, okay, would then be actually going ahead and calling in the specific index component. Okay. And the security trimming based on, give me 1 second. Okay, so the query processing component, as you see here, gets to the index component. In an on-premises scenario, in any of the normal search, the query, this results, or the query which is being typed by the user at this stage, then they would be passed back and displayed back to the user at this stage, assuming we have not configured hybrid. However, this is not the case when it comes into a hybrid scenario. Okay, what happens is, since we are working with hybrid, okay, what we see is we need to also retrieve the results from the other vertical. Remember, hybrid, as I mentioned, is done with querying the remote index, right? In this case, since we are configuring outbound, we need to retrieve the results from the other vertical, which is Office 365. At no stage, remember, which I want to again make a stress out here, that SharePoint on-prem at no stage crawls any of the other, the SharePoint Online. Okay, the way that hybrid search works is exactly when, right now, what we see in the screen, when it is the concept of the remote index, where the query processing component, which we see right now, would then make eventually a call to the SPO, the SharePoint Online's query processing component. And another important thing to note out here is at no stage does the user, authenticated user, which we saw initially, makes an interactive logon to the SPO infrastructure. Okay, so what happens is, based on what we will look into the configuration. Okay. And I will actually focus on the core configuration, specifically this part of what happens when how is the user context passed across shortly. But there is a server-to-server authentication which happens between SharePoint on-premises and the SharePoint Online. And the next step for the user to be able to go ahead and get the context of an authenticated user is termed as the rehydration process, which actually enables the SharePoint Online to validate the user identity. This is where, the part which I'm trying to highlight now, the user profile service application, this plays a very vital and a key role. When the query is being passed onto the index component in context of this rehydrated user, okay, only at that stage, and of course after a match is being made, which means if the user is indeed supposed to be a user which should get to see the results, only at that stage the relevant results are being passed back to SharePoint Online. Okay, and after that, as we see right now, it's returned back to the query processing component, and eventually this gets to the user gets to see the results in two separate blocks, as I was showing you in the user experience a minute back. So again, just trying to emphasize a key role which is being played here is the user rehydration process, and that's what we need to ensure that the user profile service application is up and working, and it's populated with the most recent data of the user that resides in the Active Directory. How does this user, now that's what when we are talking about the user profile service application in the on-premises. But remember, the user still needs to be able, be present in the SharePoint Online environment. So let's actually go ahead and look into each of these components and see how we configure some of them and how does the user actually the user identity plays a key role before he gets to see the results returned in his on-premises, result block. So the deployment phases, okay, as I was mentioning a couple of minutes back, hybrid deployment, we recommend that, we should start off with outbound hybrid. And when we start off with outbound hybrid, the deployment can be classified into three major deployment phases. One is the infrastructure setup. The second is the server-to-server trust and identity management. And of course, once these two are done, since we are looking at the search service integration, okay, at this stage, we would go ahead and configure the actual search workload. Remember, this core infrastructure is common for other workloads that I mentioned some time back, which means you should be able to configure inbound hybrid search, you should be able to configure BCS, but the specific configurations for the workload varies from the application to application. So let's get into a little more details around the infrastructure setup, which means the first component which we are going to look into is directory synchronization. But before we look into this component, let's take a overview around where each of these components plugs into. So what we see now is exactly the scenario which I mentioned towards the beginning of this session, which means I have my Office 365 environment, okay, and I have my intranet or my corpnet where I have SharePoint, okay, and my Active Directory servers. So how does the infrastructure or what are some of the core infrastructure components that is required for you to actually go ahead and set up hybrid? The first and the key important thing is directory synchronization. So I was mentioning a couple of minutes back around the user profile service application. However, the user identity needs to be able to go ahead and make it to Azure AD in Office 365. And the way we do it is deploy directory synchronization or DIRSync in one of the member servers in your on-premises environment and synchronize the users to Azure Active Directory services which eventually serves as the user base for all of the online SharePoint Online users. Once directory synchronization is done, the users would be synced to Office 365 or other Azure AD. The second important step would be to build an ACS trust between the Azure AD tenant, and we actually create a proxy in the SharePoint on-premises environment. Basically, this serves as a trust broker, right? In order and facilitates the server-to-server connectivity. Remember, I mentioned at no stage does the user does an interactive logon to the Office 365 environment. Okay, and what plays that key role in terms of ensuring that the request is coming in from a valid client here is, or rather, the server-to-server authentication part is ACS, which plays the role of this trust broker. So with all of this in place, or rather, even if I remove this component which I was just trying to show you, you should be able to configure a outbound hybrid, a configuration for your on-premises environment. Of course, to enhance the user sign-in experience, you can choose to deploy ADFS, which means you can deploy ADFS, ADFS servers on your on-prem. You can deploy ADFS proxy and build an ADFS trust with the Office 365, and then ensure that we have a single sign-on experience for the users who are trying to, go out and retrieve results from SharePoint Online. Now, remember I was talking about saying we recommend doing outbound first, because what I just showed before this last part of the animation, which I'm showing you right now, is what is required to configure outbound search. However, the moment you are trying to configure inbound, which means results from SharePoint Online, or a user logging into SharePoint Online is trying to retrieve a document from SharePoint on-premises, we would need a reverse proxy to be able to kind of cater to the requests which are coming in for an on-prem environment. So with that, what is required for you to configure an outbound hybrid search? Exactly what I'm showing you on the screen right now, and this is what we are going to do. This is what we're going to go ahead and set up today. During this session, which means we will actually go ahead and create a user. We should be able to synchronize this user to Azure AD in Office 365, then set up a server-to-server authentication. The components required to go ahead and have that successfully in place, and eventually we should be able to see that that user actually gets to see search results from on-prem as well as online. So we spoke about the core identity scenarios, or rather identity being a key important, or rather a key factor in Office 365 and for this hybrid search to work. We, of course, I'm going to say all of us are aware that when we look into Office 365, we have multiple identity types, which means we can have a cloud identity. We can actually go ahead and have DIR-sync to synchronize the on-premises users, and DIR-sync, has of course an option to either choose to synchronize a hash of the user's password to Azure AD, which means the user will be able to log in with the same set of username and password as he logs into on-premises, and of course we can convert that to a federated identity. Okay, so before we go, and of course in today's session we are going to look at directory synchronization, password sync. Before we get to this actual demo, let's quickly take a look at what are the steps to configure directory synchronization, because I mentioned that we are taking an example of an Office 365 environment which the user has just, or the company has just subscribed to. They, of course, need to activate directory synchronization from within the Office 365 admin portal. They, of course, need to add the on-premises domain. A very key part which governs the user rehydration is to ensure that the on-premises domain is added as an alternate domain to Office 365 tenant, and the user UPN must match this domain which is being added when the requests is being raised from the on-prem environment to get the results. When you add a domain, it would Office 365 would do a validation, and the Office 365 environment would actually go out and prompt you to update a TXT or an MX record so that it just goes ahead and validates it. After this, you just download directory synchronization in one of the member servers. We know that we have documentation which talks about you can install directory synchronization on a domain controller. However, that's not always the best policy to go with when you are doing it in production. And of course, run a sync to synchronize the users from on-prem. A key step is, of course, to ensure that once the users are synchronized, they should be activated and they should be granted licenses. Once these licenses are granted, they would be available to be added to SharePoint Online, and then the authorization part of SharePoint Online is taken care of. This link would talk about the DIR sync in much more details. But with that, let's get into a demo. During this demo, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you creating of a user. Okay, and this is my on-premises environment. Just because this is the first part of the demo, we actually have to go ahead and do the creation of a user in on-prem and synchronize the user to online. I create a new user here. Okay, I will, for the sake of that, or rather for the trend, I'll just name it user 3. Okay, and a password. Once we do this, as I said, this is showing in my the on-prem environment. I have a client machine. I have a member server that has directory synchronization. I have 2 web frontends and, of course, a SQL server. I'll go back to my directory synchronization server. In interest of time, I have installed DIR sync. I will run an incremental sync with a command called start-online coexistence sync. Okay, as I execute this, if you bring up the MIS client, you should see that it's actually going ahead and showing a sync in progress. Okay, and as it completes, okay, I should be able to see user 3 in my Office 365 admin center. If I go to users and groups, user 3 is still not showing up because, okay, we'll give it just a few more minutes. It shows export success. I can see it has done one add. And if we get to the details of it, I do see user 3, which means if I refresh it now, I should be able to see user 3. Yeah, there is user 3, and that's what I just synchronized. Remember, the next thing which we should do is definitely activate the sync user. I'm choosing a location for the user, and I'm activating it. Once I activate the user, see it says the password wasn't reset because the user's password is synced with the on-premises Active Directory, which is what confirms that the user will be able to log in with the same username and password as he does in on-premises environment. And this is my SharePoint online SharePoint site collection. If I now go to site settings, and if I go to people and groups, I can actually go ahead and add a user, and I should be able to see user 3 here. So user 3 shows up here, which is what I have. I'm to say I've just gone ahead and created a user, and the user shows up in my online environment. So going back to our going back to our presentation, what we just completed is we had an Office 365 environment. We had an on-premises environment. We decided to go with hybrid outbound. And once we have already enabled the synchronization of Office 365, and after that we have created a new user, and we have synchronized that user to the Azure AD in Office 365. With that, now let's look into the next configuration, which is the server-to-server the trust and identity management. To do this, there are a bunch of steps which needs to be done. A summary of those steps are: you need to replace the security token signing certificate for SharePoint. We need to actually go ahead and create an ACS trust, and also ensure that the user profile service application in on-prem has the user or has a import of the users that is going to try this workload. Okay, so let's take a look at how to establish the server-to-server authentication, and I'm going to show this in a demo. I'm going to use a script. The script is available in TechNet and also in my blog, which if you guys want to try that out later. Okay, there are 7 key steps that we need to do. For remote index to work, we need to establish an OAuth trust with ACS between SharePoint on-premises and online. This is what we call as server-to-server authentication. Basically, we register SharePoint Online as a high-trust app, and we ensure that and there is an OAuth trust, and as I mentioned, the ACS acts as a trust broker in order to brokerage the connection and the connectivity part of it before the results are returned. Okay, so what are the 7 key steps? The first step would be to replace the security token signing certificate across all SharePoint servers in on-premises, which means if you have a multi-server farm, okay, you need to ensure that the security token signing certificate is replaced across all of the servers. You need to, of course, install Windows Azure AD PowerShell, and which has a prerequisite of the sign-in assistant. The next step would be to establish trust between on-premises SharePoint farm and SharePoint Online farm by replacing the certificate. And a key step is to add the service principal name for your on-premises domain. Example, in this case, we're going to add star.spc.spocloud.com. Okay, and here is what we have. This ID which you see is the well-known app ID for SharePoint Online, for which you're going to go ahead and establish a trust with. Once that is done, you need to register SharePoint Online application principal as a trusted provider in SharePoint on-premises. After this is done, you need to set up the authentication realm for SharePoint. And finally, you'll have to configure a proxy in the on-premises farm for Azure AD, which actually goes ahead and does all of this communication for you. So I mentioned about certificates, okay, and I said that we need to replace the SharePoint security token signing certificate. What's the supportability story here? It's recommended that when you are trying to go out and set this up, you could use the self-signed certificate that you create on the SharePoint box in one of the SharePoint boxes from IIS Manager. Of course, public certification authority certificates like Baltimore, VeriSign, certificates from GoDaddy, Tawate, etc. All of the known certification providers, the certificates are supported. What is not supported and doesn't work is the domain issued certificates. So there is a commandlet set-sp security token signing service config, and you use the import signing certificate flag, in order to go ahead and import this certificate. And once you are done with this, you are still left with the key step of ensuring that your user profile service application is up and working and configured properly. Okay, on the on-premises SharePoint farm, ensure that you have the user profiles which are synchronized with Active Directory for the same set of users which you have specified in the DIRSync. We actually, to do that rehydration process, okay, ensure that we have certain set of attributes correctly populated, like the user principal name is definitely playing a key role here. So when you are trying to look at a hybrid search query and you enable verbose logs in your SharePoint farm, you should be able to go ahead and see that the user UPN is the user UPN which is being passed across, which should match the domain which you have added as an alternate domain in your to your Azure AD. Okay, with that, let's try to take a look at this configuration. Before we get into this configuration, what I have done is I have this client machine, okay, and though I have just synchronized user 3, I already, in interest of time, I have already logged in with one of the users, and what I do is we will just get to see the current status. So you saw user 1 there. I'm logged in with the same user called user 1, okay. My on-prem environment is SP Web, and right now my goal of this is to ensure that the user gets to see results from both SharePoint on-premises and SharePoint Online. If I search for results right now, okay, and I say I search for Conteso, I'm getting results, but just from SP Web, okay, and there is a document in shared documents called onprem.txt, okay. Let's go to one of the web frontends and let's look at this script. As I said, this script is available in my, in my blog and as well as in TechNet. I've already added the Microsoft.SharePoint.PowerShell. I'm defining a certain set of variables. The first set is, of course, talks about the cert. This is the cert which I'm talking about, which which is the self-signed cert. In this demo, I'm trying to go out and use a self-signed cert, and I'll show you as we replace the certificate that the security token signing certificate has this cert. If I go here, I have actually gone ahead, and if I go to my C drive, I have this cert which I have created from my on-premises environment. Okay. I would just go ahead and define these variables first of all. For the rest of the variables, I have defined the cert password. Of course, I have defined the SPCN value, and I've defined that SP Web, which I was trying to show you a few minutes back. And this is the app ID, the well-known ID for SharePoint Online. And now the next step which we would do is update the certificate on the STS for SharePoint on-premises. Okay, it says you are about to change the signing certificate for security token signing service. The normal warning. We would click on yes to all, or just to ensure that it replaces it. And after that, this needs to be done, as I said, across all of the boxes in the farm. In interest of time, I have done it on SP Web 1. Okay, and I'm showing it in SP Web 2. So once this is done, we would need to actually restart IIS and do a start and stop of the timer service. Okay, which, as I mentioned, is defined. Guys, I understand there could be questions. As I mentioned, this is like a entire packed demo. I'm going to stay back to answer, all of the questions at the end of this session. Okay, so since this is done, let's actually try to look at and see if we indeed have this certificate. And if you see, it shows SharePointWeb.hybrid.sprcloud.com. Okay, and that's what it has replaced the certificate. Now we need to convert the certificate to base 64. Okay, and what we are actually gone ahead and already defined these variables, which I'm going to do this conversion. With this, the next step would be to ensure that okay, here is something which I would like to call out. At this stage, you can you'd see various instructions which says you can switch over from the SharePoint PowerShell to Azure PowerShell. What I've tried to do on my script is ensure that you do not have to do this switch over and do variable defining again and again. So I'm trying to import the modules from Azure PowerShell and ensure that I use just one PowerShell to be able to go ahead and do all of these configurations. I'm enabling PSS remoting, and as you see, its WinRM is already set on this computer because I had to ensure that I've done this testing. I'll do a new session, okay, and then I will import the MS Online module, and also I will import the MS Online extended module, which is basically the Azure AD modules which gets imported into this ISE. The next step I will do is I will actually go ahead and connect from this interface to the Azure AD for my Office 365 tenant. As I do this, this is going to prompt me for my username and password. Okay, and let me just connect on that. Okay, a successful connection to this would just ensure that it returns me back to that same prompt where I'm trying to do. And now I need to register the on-premises STS as a service principal in Office 365. The way I do that is I create a new service principal credential, and with the app principal ID for the app ID, the well-known app ID which I defined in the variable, and then I am setting that as in context of my current in context of my current domain name. Okay, so I would do that. Okay, at this stage, if you actually go ahead and check a value of, say, $SPNs, okay, you see that I actually see this registered as hybrid.spocloud.com, which I have mentioned earlier. Okay, and now then I need to set the context ID. And okay, I'm so used to, as we do this, as the context ID is set, then finally the last step would be to ensure that I establish the on-premises farm a trust with ACS. The way I do that is I do a $site equals to get SP site. Okay, and let me just go ahead and define that. Here is where we have seen on and off issues where you run this in context of a user which does not have privileges to query the SP site object, and it fails. So you need to ensure that you are running it in the in the current context. After that, we are trying to go ahead and set the authentication realm. Okay, and once the realm is set, then we create the SP Azure Access Control Service Application Proxy. I'm naming it as ACS. Okay, and what I do and what eventually we will do is we will then set that to be the trusted security token issuer. Okay, so that it could pretty well go ahead and do the brokerage part of it. That's what we are doing, and we specify the metadata endpoint for which it is going to go ahead and use as for this communication. As I run that, that's what I'm trying to set correctly, and that sets up the server-to-server authentication part of it, which it would be required, in order for the communication to happen. Okay, with that, if we look back into our, or I will rather bring back my presentation. Give me. Okay, so what we did is we set up the server-to-server authentication and the ACS trust. If we look back into this and the deployment phases, we have done an infrastructure setup. We have done the server-to-server trust and identity management. The final configuration part of it is to set up the search service integration, which has two steps, which means you have to configure a result source and you have to create a query rule, which has to be on the vertical which you are trying to configure search on, which means if you are configuring outbound, at this stage you have to configure it in your on-premises environment. So I will go back to my other web server, okay, and I am on my central administration. I'll go to manage service applications, and I will go to my search service application. Okay, I will create a result source, and when I click on new result source, okay, I can give it any name. It's okay, I've given it an SPO result, source name as SPO result, and then I'll click on remote SharePoint. Here is where I specify the URL for my online SharePoint site collection that I'm configuring this with, which is this. I have this configured as http://hybridignite.sharepoint.com. Okay, and that pretty much, and I save it. The first test for a successful configuration is if you go to this SPO result source, okay, and you click on test source, you should be able to see a succeeded message, what we see right now, which means this one is trying to go ahead and ensure, or if we enable ULS logs verbose on this, I do have some references in my blog, and on this one, we would see that it's actually successfully getting the OAuth token in context of this specific request which is being made. The last thing which we need to do is to create a query rule in context of this one, the result source which we have created. And in order to do that, we'll go to this SPO result source and we will create a new query rule. I will give it any name, SPO SPQR. Okay. Context, I will just select it to all sources. Okay, it shows the SPO result which I created. We are not looking at refining of the query conditions and all, so I'm just trying to, you can of course look into query conditions. I'm clicking on removing query condition, which makes it just a kind of vanilla search. I'll add a result block, okay, under actions. I'll ensure that I choose the result block, the result source which I created. You can choose the number of items that needs to be returned on it. I'm choosing 4. Okay. I will choose this block always shown above the core results, so that I always get to see a block from online, and click on OK. And click on save. And now, if I go back to my client machine, okay, I will go back to my home page, and let's see if this user gets to see anything extra when it is trying to search for a keyword which it was searching earlier called Contoso. Okay, and at this stage, that's exactly what we see. We see that it is returning result from the site collection, which is here, hybridignite.sharepoint.com, and these documents are returned to this user. Okay, and so does it gets one result from its on-prem environment. Okay, which means the user, is successfully able to query from both on-premises as well as online, and does not need to worry about where the document resides during, when this deployment is going over. Okay, so with that, that's what I wanted to kind of share. As I mentioned here, just my second last slide. With all of these components in place, you will see the search results exactly what we are seeing right now. And I would open this up for questions. No questions? Guys, if you guys want to unmute, ask a question, type